Hi everyone! So this is my talk. Just what is an Indigenous video game? There we go. Tansi, Meagan Byrne san Apatwako Sisan, Hamilton, Ontario, Nuchin. Hi, I'm Meagan Byrne. I am a Apatwako Sisan, or federally known as the Ontario Métis. I am a game designer and owner of Achimastawastan Games. And if you want to follow me, you can follow me on Twitter at either Byrne_Megan, or you can follow my company at Achimo Games. So just before we get started, just want to bring out a couple terms I may reference, and just cool things to know. So two of the terms I usually use a lot when talking about my work is Indigenous futurisms and survivance. So Indigenous futurisms, if you're familiar with Afrofuturisms, you probably have a good idea what that's about. But essentially it's a movement which consists of different media and all expressing Indigenous perspectives of the future, but the Indigenous way of understanding, and I am using this as an umbrella term, but specifically within the Anishinaabe, Cree, and several of the Six Nations, the concept of time can be, you have your past future, your past present, your future present, and everything kind of in between. So the idea of time as being something that's very linear is kind of at odds with an Indigenous way of looking at the world. And so we take this kind of idea of this, place of time and looking at the future, and we usually express it in things like science fiction or all the other subgenres. It's a term that's specifically coined by Anishinaabe Métis Professor Dr. Grace Dillon in her anthology Walking the Clouds, an anthology of Indigenous science fiction. Now, survivance is another term you may not have heard of, but it's essentially, its literal definition is an active sense of presence that continuates of native stories and not a mere reaction or survivable name. And what that essentially means is this idea that in addition to, being resilient and resilience, we should also look at something that goes beyond that. So in resilience, it's sort of you are staying the same in the face of adversity, whereas survivance is you are becoming better in the face of adversity. And this is a term that was coined by Anishinaabe scholar and writer Gerald Visner in Survivance Narratives of Native Presence. And I definitely recommend you check out both of those if you're interested in more of this stuff. So what makes your game Indigenous? This is a question I definitely heard a lot when I was starting out. I don't hear it so much now, and I think that's in part to the work of game designers like Elizabeth Leponce, who have really pushed this idea that we need to stop asking Indigenous people to perform a particular kind of indigeneity. And so as being something that I got a lot when I was younger, it definitely put me on a spot. It's also not the same as asking the question, what nation are you from? Who on your team is Indigenous? These questions are still valid, still should be asked, even by non-Indigenous people, especially if you're looking at something that looks very visibly Indigenous. It's fine to ask the question of oh, which nation are you a part of? Who are you responsible to? So when I center myself, one of the things I usually point out the fact is that I don't have access to a very strong, nation in terms of I don't have that connection, not that the nation's not strong. And because I don't have that connection, usually what I have to be very careful in my work is saying that this is me, this is sort of my experience, this does not speak for other Indigenous people, this doesn't even necessarily speak for other Indigenous people within my own nation, which would be the Ontario Métis Nation. And even that is a big umbrella term that has lots of different groups under it. But I am responsible to my family, and they will call me out on it if I make mistakes or something like that. So I'm always responsible to someone. And that's part of why we as Indigenous creators are always asking, who on your team is Indigenous and what is their nation? Because essentially what we're asking is who are you, where are you from, and who are you responsible for? Who gets to call you out if you do something wrong is what we're asking. But this question what makes your game Indigenous, this isn't really about, you know, asking for nationhood or asking for responsibility. This is asking for performance. And one of the things that I point out in a lot of my talks when I talk about what is authentic in Indigenous is, what does that mean? What does authentically Indigenous even mean? You know, when you think of something, you know, just right now as like a little exercise, just in your head, you don't have to say it out loud, but just like, what is it conjuring in your head when someone's like, oh, that's Native, or that's Indigenous, or that's First Nations, or that's Métis, or that's Inuit? You know, in your head, you're probably going to have some images that pop up. And I guarantee you those images that pop up are very much grounded in that sort of, you know, feathers and buckskin and powwow outfits and particular kinds of tattoos and using like animal skins and being like very close to the land and being like very primitive. A lot of times that's the word that comes up. And when you start examining, where do we get these images from? How do we understand them? And some people have pointed to things like, well, you know, it's film and television, but it's more than that. Because up until this moment in time, and I would only say within the last decade or so, have Indigenous people been able to be their own curators. So everything up to this moment, I would say, with the exception of a few places, your idea of authentically Indigenous has been curated to you by a non-Indigenous person. Or if they are an Indigenous person, most likely they're not Indigenous to that community or that nation that they are curating. And so again, they just perpetuate these same ideas of what is Indigenous. And like I said here, even when Indigenous people are the curators, we're still sort of subject to this pre-developed mindset. It comes up in film studies, it comes up in, you know, art curation. And of course, like, unless you're totally in charge and you are the final say-so, you're always going to have somebody else as the lens that you are working through. So if you are an Indigenous person working in, say, a gallery, you're probably working for a department of that gallery. You probably still have a boss who gets to have a final say. And usually a lot of Indigenous people find themselves fighting, and it's usually over this: what is authentically Indigenous? Yeah, it's Indigenous because I am Indigenous. And this is true of so many pieces, not just my own piece, but like so many other people, other Indigenous people's work. And it's kind of a it's kind of a cop out in some ways, but in other cases it's sort of like, well, what else are you gonna say? You know, there are times for discussion and there are times where it's just not appropriate. Like, it's not really appropriate to have this sort of discussion of, like, you know, colonial gaze in art mediums when you're just trying to do an interview about your video game. Like, I mean, yeah, I'm sure lots of people would love it, but also at the same time, if you're just trying to be a game developer and you're just trying to promote your work, you really don't want to be that Indigenous person who's like, I need to speak now for all Indigenous people because this is wrong, because this is affecting me right now. And that can be an uncomfortable place for Indigenous people to be constantly placed in, to constantly have to justify, you know, what is it about your work that makes it Indigenous? And so I just kind of use the whole, it's Indigenous because I'm Indigenous. But not everything I make is Indigenous, and I'm sure you're super confused now, and that's totally okay, because we're going to dive into my work, and I'm going to kind of talk about my thoughts and feelings on what I think is Indigenous versus what I think is not Indigenous of my own work. So, when I call something Indigenous that I am working on, then it's Indigenous. If I'm working on something and I don't call it Indigenous, then that's up for interpretation, but it's not up for somebody to sort of take my indigeneity and then slap it on that project and say it's okay. So if I worked on a project and there were elements of indigeneity in it, I may not have signed off on that. I may not have been okay with it. Usually I'm very vocal if I'm not okay with it and it happened anyways. But again, we're going back to like this is sort of, it's my word that I'm calling something Indigenous versus not Indigenous. So this is a really cool project I did as part of my schooling at Sheridan College, which was part of a larger team. And this game, called Tiny Planets, we were tasked to create a game for the Holland Bloorview Children's Hospital's new game system, which is actually really cool, and it's still in operation. So what it is a screen and a carpeted floor, and you can kind of see like a mock-up of the floor over here. And that floor is a series of little colored carpet squares, and each carpet square is kind of tied into each color, and they're like on-off switches. And they designed this for kids who, couldn't use traditional toys due to like health reasons. They used it for kids with limited mobility, or who are in wheelchairs, or who maybe did not have access to use of their hands, but did have access to use of their feet. And so we essentially created this like really cute little space game where standing on the different colors creates an increase in mass for your planet that's tied to that color. And kids like loved this. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing this, and I worked on it, but it was part of a bigger team, and I would not call this an Indigenous game. However, I would say that because of my background, it definitely added to things. There were things that we took out early on that kind of just felt a little colonial, but that could have been done, like, that's not necessarily because I was Indigenous that happened, but it did help kind of like frame my worldview around my game design. So this is another piece I did with a team, and it was called Layers of Madness. And if anyone has read The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a fantastic, scary short story, and I highly, highly recommend it. It's a feminist Victorian horror. And we wanted to do this like cute game where we're like, oh, you're in the wallpaper and you're playing as this main character, and you're sort of going through the themes in the book, which are the idea of, postpartum depression and improper healthcare in the Victorian age. And we had so much fun. I was the lead artist on this, and these are all my designs. And we had so much fun working on this. And again, as a team, I was the only Indigenous person on the team. So again, I wouldn't call this particularly like an Indigenous piece. Now, what would I call an Indigenous piece? Well, that would start with my very first solo project, which was called Wanisinowin Lost. And this piece is a very personal piece that I did in 2015, which was me exploring through game mechanics just what is it to be Indigenous away from community? What is it to be Indigenous when you find out when you're like 10? What is it to be Indigenous and not feel like you're authentic? And these were questions that were asked of me, like a child, which is like just unfair. And also, these are things I asked myself. And it took a really long time, like personally, outside of this game, it took me a really long time to kind of come to terms with being white passing and Indigenous, and feeling sometimes like, well, I don't belong here. I know this isn't unique. This has been described as the Métis experience, but a lot of Indigenous people go through it. It's a uncomfortable burden to bear. It's not insurmountable though. And I think it's something that takes a lot of time and work and slowness. One of the things that I talk about now when I think about this whole idea of reconnecting with community that has been lost through the colonial projects of Canada and the United States, I think of the term stitching muscle. So I don't know if anyone here's lost a limb. I haven't. But my dad almost lost his thumb. And I remember when he was talking about it, they were like, oh, yeah, it was like fine. And the doctor even said if it had just been a little bit more and the whole thing came off, they still probably could have saved it. And that has always like really stuck with me, that idea that we have this knowledge and science around reattaching limbs, but you think about how quick and how easy it is to sever that piece. And then how much labor and nuance and knowledge and time and healing goes into repairing that damage. And that's how I kind of look at my experience and my journey returning to community, returning to language, returning to ways of knowing and being, is it's like stitching muscle. And one of the things that I don't know if I've come to terms with, but I'm still kind of trying to come to terms with, is you may do all this work and it fails and the limb cannot be saved. Either through, it was too long, it was too damaged. And this is something that I and a lot of other Indigenous people are going to and will and have experienced. And it's just something we work through. And there is no knowing what the future holds for it. So you kind of have to just do the work and then pray a lot. And I think also for me, and this is very in keeping with like Cree people, is like just have a sense of humor about the dark stuff. This is also very similar to like my dad's side. He's Newfoundlander Irish, and you have to have a like humor about the dark things because you can't cry all the time even though you really want to. And I'm sorry if that got too emotional. Let's go on to something a little bit lighter. Here's an adorable children's mobile game I made. This was, again, another project I did in a group. I was the lead artist on this. I didn't do the mouse, but I did the rest of the environment, and I did the main character. And it was just supposed to be this really sweet, lovely puzzle game where you played as an adventure mouse and you solve puzzles in order to get pieces to put together a hot air balloon, and then you were going to go off into a termite castle in the sky. And I wouldn't necessarily label this as an Indigenous game, but you can definitely see my influence in the game as you're playing it, in that you have this sort of like sovereign Indigenous population who is suddenly threatened by this new group who just are like technologically superior and or not even technologically superior, like technologically different or technologically at odds, and are just happening to damage the ecosphere of this particular community. And so it's like your job as the hero to kind of just go and explore and find out what's going on and seeing if you can like negotiate something. We never got that far because this was just a prototype, but you can play it. I think it's just for PC now because we weren't able to continue support on mobile, but you can definitely download it and play it on the PC. It's really sweet. And it's one of those ones where I was like, is this Indigenous? I'd say no, but also because of my influence on the game, because I was the lead artist, because I did do some of the programming, because it was only a 4-person group and I was pretty vocal. I'm always vocal. So you could make the argument, but this is one of those ones where it's like, I'm not saying it is, but also like, I wouldn't begrudge someone making the argument that it has those flavors. Now, what I would begrudge is if then this would not happen with my team. But if I had someone on that team who had decided to take it and slap the label, this is an Indigenous game, and maybe try to put feathers on people and stuff like that, and then use me as a means of saying, well, it's okay, that would not be okay. And sort of, this is not me trying to say like what is and is not Indigenous in games in terms of how each Indigenous creator approaches their work, but it is me kind of like opening up the conversation about like what is and is not at this point in time acceptable. Now, I really do want to make stuff that like feels Indigenous sometimes because I did grow up on this stuff. Like I did go to powwows, I did go to like drumming circles and learning a lot of this stuff sort of in a way that I didn't realize, I guess, it was Indigenous. And I don't know if that probably doesn't make sense. It's a weird nuance for someone who has been sort of raised in a Western educational system because of the ask for Indigenous people to perform in a certain way. When you're kind of like when you're Indigenous and you're just kind of absorbing this stuff as a child, you don't really think of it as being this separate thing, as being a performance from because you're on the inside. So these things can kind of get, to an Indigenous person, can get kind of like gray. But at the end of the day, yeah, okay, we do like this stuff. Like, powwows have really gorgeous traditional looking pieces. I am a big fan of like orange and blue. Like, that's some of my favorite dancers use that kind of combination. And I would love to do pieces that, feel to, I was suppose, an outside non-Indigenous person like an Indigenous game. That's not what I'm saying in these things. It's not that we don't want to do these things. It's just when you feel like that's all you're allowed to do, or when you feel like you're questioned about doing anything different, you kind of have like one of a few responses. Now, for me, it's either like early on, I sort of just shut down. I was like, fine, I won't do anything that looks Indigenous. It was sort of like, that high school teenager attitude of like, if you won't let me do what I want to do, I just won't do it. And, that's still me limiting myself due to somebody else's perception and saying what they think should be valid. And while it's fine to do art in a reactionary way, it shouldn't be the only way you're doing art, and it shouldn't inform your entire practice. You should feel free to do these things as an Indigenous person that you really want to do, that you really want to talk about. So yeah, this is a character design I came up with ages ago, and actually the pattern on her poncho is from Christy Belcourt, and I just want to make these things, of course, but also I kind of need to come to terms with and be okay and feel strong enough to say that first thing that I said, which was like, it's Indigenous because I'm Indigenous, and I do not have to perform my indigeneity to satisfy, your pre-developed understanding of what Indigenous is. So now, yeah, I'm making games that have Indigenous people in it. That actually deal with Indigenous issues inside Indigenous communities, that don't necessarily speak to people outside of those communities. But this is something I brought up in an article I did a little while ago. That's okay. We have this idea in the West that you have to like localize to the extreme. Like, you have to make sure that your stuff is as palatable to as many people as possible. And if you're not, you're kind of going against the grain. But then I'm like, I grew up on bootleg anime and manga. I grew up on stuff that was coming from countries that didn't even know I existed and never decided to make it for me. This stuff was not made for me. It was not made for my population. It was not even made for my country. This was made for them. And you know what? We loved it anyways. It spoke to us because things will speak to people across nations, across countries, across political lines. Art is art because it speaks, not because it's geared to a particular group of people. People will consume things they think are cool. People will watch and read things that they just think is going to be neat. That's okay. I actually think that's how we should look at games. It's neat. Just be Marge Simpson. I just think it's neat. So now I'm working on, this game called Hill Agency. And it's going to be set in this world. And it's going to be 3D, and I'm really excited. And, this is an entirely Indigenous world with a majority Indigenous team creating it. And actually, one of the really cool things, and I'm really excited about this, is my team is majority Indigenous, but also of those Indigenous people on the team, majority Cree and Métis. So we are kind of speaking from within our own collective nation, even though we each come from different communities. And I'm really excited about that, because that just adds so much nuance to what we're doing. And I really think people are going to love this. So one last thing before I go. I just want to show you something I'm working on, if it plays. Yeah. So this is a demo for a piece that's going to be shown at Imaginative in October called A Night Call. Ignore the texture streaming pool part. And so I just wanted to do this really gentle night sky while kind of listening to a phone call that's just kind of got a touch of Indigenous futurisms to it. And part of all these things that I do is my act of survivance. Like even when I'm not making quote unquote Indigenous games, I'm still enacting survivance. So that's my talk. Thanks. And if you got any questions, you can totally reach out to me on Twitter. Great. Hey, bye.